Oh my. Thank you, Andrew, for those very touching words and your sharp memory. I really am humbled to be standing here today, deeply honored. And Cheryl, to you in particular, I need to say, it takes a lot of courage for you and the university to nominate somebody as a distinguished alumnus who was not only unemployed at the time, but had been in and out of prison for the last 3 or 4 years. So, I'll explain, but so thank you. I want to start by saying that I grew up in the Fraser Valley of BC, and Andrew already alluded to the fact that we both grew up in the Fraser Valley. I grew up in a home that was deeply shaped by 3 intertwining values, and they were Bible, music, and culture, at which point culture meant the German language, and not just German, but you say the German. So it was Bible, music, and the German. This was indeed a kind of Mennonite holy trinity in our home and in our community, and I think the long shadow of a grandfather who I never knew personally was definitely a part of that. Those 3 were woven together as tightly as the 3 braids of this sweetgrass braid here. Pretty much every day consisted of some set of activities that grew out of those holy 3. Whether it was music lessons or children's choir, German school on Saturday morning, Sunday school, youth group, Bible classes at MEI, as Andrew mentioned, and so on. All these different practices were done, I believe, with the same intention as I have seen sweetgrass used, and that is to maintain and build a connection between our family, our community, and the Creator. Looking back over a half century or more of conscious memory, I can say that 2 of these values have stayed with me, deeply rooted and deeply informing my life and identity. I would say not unchanged, but the continuity is very strong. And those 2 would be the Bible and music. These are still 2 constants in my life. And without a doubt, my years at Mennonite Brethren Bible College shaped my identity and my career on both those fronts. The 3rd value, the 3rd strand of my life braid, I might say, has morphed considerably from those early years in Clearbrook, but the strand is still there. Its evolution went something like this. And again, Andrew, you already picked up a little bit on that. First was an interest or an exposure and almost a demand to be involved in the German, to an interest in languages, which expanded then into an interest in cultures, which grew then, as I was rooted here in Winnipeg at the time, into more Indigenous awareness, and finally into Indigenous community engagement. Winnipeg and even MBBC played a significant part in that metamorphosis. The most recent chapters, say the last decade or so of my life, have been significantly shaped by an encounter with one specific Cree community, not far from Saskatoon. Indeed, it's just on the doorstep of Rostern, which is where my mother was born, and where my grandparents first landed when they came almost a century ago as settlers and immigrants from Russia. So it's here in the Beardys and Okemasis First Nation where I've been blessed to get to know from and to learn from elders and grandparents, teachers and students, community leaders and neighbors. This encounter continues to blossom and is bearing fruit in ways I could not have imagined 10 years ago. As I've seen instances of inclusivity, generosity and good humor, forgiveness, and overall resilience, that word which gets used so much, but I cannot think of a better word, resilience, in the midst of the many pains and challenges of life on this one reserve. My years at MBBC were intensely rich and formative, and of course, they were also immensely fun. Like so many, I came for just 1 year and was caught by the Winnipeg whirlpool. It was the musical life, choir, instrumental music that attracted me, and it was the Bible teaching that captivated me. It's hard to believe that it's been 35 years since I graduated, and a year later where I graduated from U of Winnipeg with an anthropology degree. Looking back, I see that the vast majority of my career and my convictions have been shaped by these three strands of Bible, music, and culture. And much of my greatest delight has been not just in the exploration of these strands, but in the integrating, in the overlap and the interplay of these. Just a couple of sample memories. While I was a music minister and associate pastor in Coaldale, Andrew, thank you, because you highlighted the fact that Genesis and the stories of creation have just played a rich part of my life. And so I wanted to tell the story of creation by, we got together a community chorus to sing Haydn's Creation. And because the biblical creation story raises so many good questions and also a bunch of weird questions, I thought, let's bring out Pierre Gilbert, who can do a good Bible teaching series, and which we had in Coaldale at the time. Pierre, I don't even know if you remember that, but probably about 20 years ago or so. Another memory. While a Bible teacher and for a couple of years a choir director at Bethany College, had the choir learn to sing Silent Night and also Amazing Grace in Cree. And not just to sing it, but the blessing was in watching what that did for one of our students who was from northern Saskatchewan and for whom Cree was his first language. Hearing this large choir of mostly white, mostly Mennonite students singing in his mother tongue. After several years of relationship building between Bethany College and the Beardy's community, in particular the high school where we did a lot of our connecting, I was still flabbergasted when one of the key elders connected with the high school came to me one day and said, "Randy, would you be interested in helping us plan an Easter program for our school?" Not something that you can do in most public schools, but the on-reserve school you can. He said, "Most of the students here are familiar with the Christmas story. We do a Christmas program every year, but we don't do an Easter story." And he says these students need to hear more about Jesus. Would you be willing to help us put together an Easter program? Well, yes. Yes, I would. And let's do it in a way that makes sure that students understand that the story of Jesus' death and resurrection is not a white man's story. It's a story that is for all nations to hear. More recently, as I shifted from the work at Bethany College to working with Mennonite Central Committee, I began to ponder and to write about, and I'll thank Esther, who I see sitting in Esther Eptison, sitting in the seats here. I began to write about what it means to pray the Lord's Prayer when one of our Canadian prisons, federal prisons, is right in sight across the river from where I live in Saskatoon. What does it mean to say these things? Your will be done. Give us this day our daily bread. When those have very complex and conflicted meanings inside the prison walls. As I look back on the various elements of my career that really got launched here at Mennonite Brethren Bible College, part of the legacy, the heritage of CMU, I want to offer three reflections, three things that I'm still learning and still working on that come for these three strands of Bible, music, and culture in my life. First, remember to acknowledge what needs acknowledging. I grew up with an awareness of one basic acknowledgement that was supposed to change everything: the confession of Jesus Christ as Lord. That this is a part of a journey of faith which is made concrete and made public in the act of baptism. And that does remain a central acknowledgement of my life. But I've been learning, particularly from my Cree friends, that acknowledgement is important in many areas of life. I've learned that it's important to acknowledge the treaties and the relationships that they create between Indigenous peoples and those of us who came later as settlers and immigrants. So today, as we've been reminded, we are gathered in Treaty 1 territory. My wife and I own a home in Treaty 6 territory in Saskatoon. To say this, to make this kind of acknowledgement, sets out a historical reality. Acknowledgement begins with remembering, and remembering is a profoundly biblical act. To remember is to shape our identity, both as present reality and as future possibilities. Acknowledgement often is mixed with pain because of the complexity and the brokenness of our stories. And acknowledgement can also be an expression of gratitude and commitment, growing out of that gratitude. As I've reflected on my time at MBBC, there are 3 influential people that I feel called to acknowledge with gratitude tonight. First, I think of Alan Gunther, my Old Testament prof for only 1 year here before he left to teach at seminary, and then I was blessed to have him again for a number of years as a student in Fresno. Alan had a unique gift for ushering students into what he called and what we forever remembered as that aha experience of encountering the Scriptures as God's Word. I think of George Shillington, and it has pleased me and excited me greatly to know, George, that you're here tonight, and so I want to publicly acknowledge your role in my life as one who opened the New Testament to us students with passion, persuasion, and flair, and also pointed me in the direction of McMaster University, which was a great gift. So thank you, George. And thirdly, I think of the man who probably accomplished just as much as Alan and as George in terms of opening the Scriptures to us as students, although he continually protested he was no theologian, and that is Bill Berg. And I don't know if Bill is here this evening, but definitely, Bill, I want to acknowledge this. Under his choral direction, we sang countless settings of Bible passages written by insightful spiritual commentators like Bach and Mendelssohn and Brahms. Choir was Bible study. I owe much to these men and to the many other people who led the school that I attended in the 1980s. None of us are truly self-made. We are the fruit of previous generations, and we are the intersections of many strands of community. 4 generations of my own family have intersected with MBBC, and this too calls for acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge my grandfather Klassen, again, who I never knew, but he and other leaders who were on the founding board of MBBC had the foresight and the drive some 85 years ago to establish such a college to serve the churches. I acknowledge the next generation and my Aunt Martha Thiessen, who began her nursing career in an MCC refugee camp in 1949. And one of the great highlights of her life, as she wrote, as she prepared her own eulogy, or her biography a couple of years ago, she passed away 2 years ago at 96 or 97 years old, was the year that she spent here at MBBC in 1960 and 61. I want to acknowledge several of my cousins who helped put MBBC in my line of sight so that I ended up here in 1980. And then the 4th generation, I want to acknowledge my nephew Aaron, my sister's son, a student in one of the very first out-of-town cohorts who passed away last year. His journey with cancer was long and hard, but he met it with confidence in his Creator and Redeemer. And I know that the friendships, the relationships that he built throughout of town were a part of that story. A second learning that I want to share with you, that I'm still working on. Start with the end in mind. I found this a very useful thing when working with choirs. The first thing you learn is the ending of the song. Now, I don't know if that's something that I got from Bill or where that came from, but I find that very... Is that what you do, Janet? Yeah? Okay. Yeah. Why? Because no matter how difficult the piece can be, you always can end confidently. Right? And you never actually know if you're going to have enough time to rehearse the whole thing. The middle gets muddled sometimes, but you can end confidently. Start with the end in mind. And so every often I remind myself that this is important in the bigger matters of life as well. I remember this, now, George, I don't know if I'm going to get this right, but I remember this as central to your teaching about the message of Paul. Eschatology is at the heart of our faith. A vision of Christ, reconciling all, reigning over all, renewing all things. This is the vision that calls us forward, a vision that inspires confidence and courage and hope in our challenging journeys and our wilderness wanderings. So, learn the end of the song well, and that helps us through the whole tune. A third and final thing that I'm still learning. Choose your key wisely. This has become a bit of a pet peeve of mine in some church singing that I'm involved with. But I'm just going to keep it personal at this point. The key of F or the key of G? Which key will I use? The last 5 years of my life have not unfolded as I thought they would. While I was at MBBC, the conviction grew in me that Bible teaching would be my life's career, my vocation, my calling. 4 years ago, Bethany College closed its doors. And after 13 good years of my experience there, 88 years of the college, this vocation was taken away. And I stumbled into service with MCC, helped in no small part by Eileen, who you're about to hear from. And I discovered the world of restorative justice. Thank you, Eileen. Restorative justice, putting biblical shalom into practice in the very challenging world of victim-offender relationships. This became a meaningful new career for me that seemed to be a very natural outgrowth of my engagement with the scriptures. And just so that you understand, this was the reason for my regular visits to prison. It was always voluntary. But then this career, too, was brought to a sudden and unexpected conclusion earlier this year. So 2 doors slamming shut in 4 years. And both of these have been the occasion of some soul searching. With both of these, I could tell the story in a way that pointed fingers, that could point a finger at myself, at a sense of failure. I mean, what is it to be a teacher and not have students want to come to your school so that the school has to close? Or to tell the story in a way that dwells on bitterness. I'm sometimes tempted to narrate these stories as stories of failure, and I call that the key of F. But I'm working hard to tell this story in the key of G, that is focusing on grace and gratitude and God. I'm still in a time of transition. Today I don't rightly know where I'm going as far as my career is concerned. But my years at MBBC set the direction and taught me to walk in a good way. I acknowledge that the Creator God, the great mystery, is still present in this story as I read the scriptures, as I am nurtured by songs, new and old, and as I grow in this reconciliation walk with First Nations communities. And so I hope to keep singing in the key of G for some time yet. Thank you.